Is our chairperson, but he's a little under the weather, and he was talking a lot, and decided that it would probably be better if he did not attend, and so he is watching from home. He asked me to moderate this brief meeting on his behalf. Therefore, we have one item for discussion and action. That is revision of most various school board policies as recommended by forethought. The specific items will be presented by Mr. Jason Nolan, Assistant Superintendent of Administration. And for the record, these changes were previously submitted to board members for consideration prior to this meeting. Mr. Rosen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Smith, Superintendent Downing, we have several things to talk to you about tonight that's come to us by way of forethought. Of course, these have been already approved and reviewed by our attorney, Mr. Geis, and he affirms each of these policy provisions, strictly talking policy provisions. So, just to give you a little background, during the 2021 legislative session, there were over 400 bills that were introduced that had the word school in them. And so a lot of action was being taken in Baton Rouge that really centered around schools. Tonight I want to bring to you the revisions to discipline that come out of Act 473. So that's what we're going to talk about. And each one of these really builds on each other. Okay, so the first one is file JCD. The policy is student conduct. Again, this is a revised policy. And essentially, this is our student code of conduct that will be revised, that requires progressive levels of interventions. There's progressive levels of interventions for the students in their discipline behavior and their conduct. And so there's minor infractions up to major infractions. And so what we have to do now is come back and develop a student code of conduct that gives us a progressive level of infractions and a progressive level of interventions that correlate to those interactions or to those infractions. The code of conduct shall include an information deterrent and appeal process all the way up to expulsion, which I'll explain to you in just a moment. So the student conduct revision is kind of the umbrella for the rest of these policies that we're going to talk about. Any questions about policy JCD and student conduct? All right, the next policy is file Jde Policy Discipline, and this is a revision. This policy has been revised to now include that we endeavor to address student behavior with a focus of based intervention and supports. Again, it kind of follows the student code of conduct that we just mentioned, but they want a basis for us to develop a basis of intervention and supports that are in accordance to the level of the degree of the issue of the infraction, and you have interventions that match that. The entire discipline policy that we're talking about, the whole effort is to look for classroom and school interventions that do not take the students out of the classroom. They do not want them limited on their classroom instruction. Added to the policy is a prescribed list of actions that we, as a board, will take into account, from oral to written reprimands all the way up to disciplinary measures by the faculty of the school. Also, there's a protocol for what happens when a student is removed, and there's a listing now that is really dictated to us in the policy about things that should be done, and at least one of the items in that list, there's about 10 things on that list, at least one of them has to be done. The intervention has to be provided before that student can return to class. The revision also includes the discipline of students in the virtual programs. They begin that process here in Act 473. So we have some things for the virtual program in place already. And so what we're going to do is we're going to formalize that and bring that back to you when we formulate our entire discipline plan like we did last year. So that's another part of things that I'm going to be working on. Also, so there's some new definitions for firearms and also for virtual instruction that I'll talk about in just a moment. So any questions about discipline, student discipline?
Ms. Smith.
The next policy is filed JDD, policy is suspension. Now, these are going to escalate. We're going to talk about a suspension in this policy, and then the next one is expulsion. And this revision has added in that when a student is suspended for more than 10 days, which we don't ever do, but if a student is suspended for more than 10 days, that they will be placed in an alternative setting so that they can maintain and continue to receive services in education. You know, if you think about SPED, that's the same thing we do with special education students. Once they hit that 10-day mark, we have to provide an alternative form of education. Well, now the policy has been adopted to regular ed as well. So this policy 473 has added a lot of work in the discipline of, so there's a lot of steps now that our administrators are going to have to be in-serviced on, trained on, and coached up on as far as things that they have to do. It also includes if there is damage to school property. Not only does that include school property, but now it's personal property of the employee, staff member, and or student. And so this policy calls for the student cannot come back to school until full reimbursement has been made, and or you have a payment policy that the principal will set up with that person to try to make sure that things are squared away. With this policy, with the suspension, there is also a layer of appeal now that has been provided that wasn't there before. Remember, the suspension stopped with the principal. That was the end of it. Now there's a layer of appeal that follows up to it, that follows the same pattern that the law calls for an expulsion. So now what can happen is that a suspension can be appealed to the superintendent. If the superintendent affirms, modifies, or overturns, it ends there. They can appeal that decision to the board, to you guys. And so you have the opportunity to affirm, modify, or overturn. They have 5 days to do that after the superintendent makes his decision. After the board makes a decision, the parent and or guardian of the student has 10 days to file their appeal with a judicial court, and they can either affirm, modify, or overturn a suspension. So, any questions about this policy? That was suspension. The next one is JDE Policy Expulsion. This is again a revised policy. Act 473 now requires the same notification process that we do with if we're recommending expulsion as we do with a suspension. The board, based on the board's code of conduct, the student conduct that we'll have for you, we will now advise the student of the accusation. We will now allow the student to tell their side of the story. The caveat to this policy is we will not only contact the person via email, the parent guardian via email or phone call, we also have to send a certified letter notifying them of the expulsion, of the recommendation for expulsion. Then there's the same appeal process. Well, normally the appeal process stops with the superintendent and or his designee, that'd be Mr. McCauley. But now the parent or guardian of the student have the opportunity within 5 days to file an appeal with the board. The board can either affirm, they can modify, or overturn. And then if the parent or guardian does not like that, they have 10 days to take it to judicial court. And the judicial court can look at the case or look at the infraction, and they can affirm, modify, or overturn. So there's 2 more layers now to suspension and expulsion that we did not have prior to this act. Also, you see there's in this one virtual instruction. The provisions related to mandatory recommendation for expulsions do not apply to virtual instruction. They do not apply. Outside of the big 3, those things do not apply. And the act basically says as long as the student is receiving instruction in their home, the automatic things for recommendation for expulsion do not apply. Also, in this, under this expulsion, the length of a knife has been increased. You know, there's a mandatory recommendation for expulsion for a certain length of a knife. Now they've expanded it to 2.5 inches. So I guess you can have a knife 2 quarter inch and you're okay. I don't know, we hopefully have any knives. So, but that's also some of the verbiage in there. Any questions about the massive overhaul of expulsion?
I have one question. What was the wisdom behind extending the length of the knife?
Coach Downey, do you have any idea of that? I don't know.
I was wondering why we were making bigger knives when it's up in the school. So, thank you.
Any questions about this overhaul?
Mr. Rowland, do we still for drugs and alcohol on campus or hitting a teacher or something, like that's always been automatic?
Still have the big
Has that
three.
changed?
Still, the big three are, all of this is outside of the big
Outside
three.
of that, okay.
Yes, ma'am. We still hold to the big three.
Okay.
Any other?
For those that may not be aware, would you explain the big three?
Drugs and alcohol on campus, weapons on campus, and bodily injury to a staff. Any other? The next to last policy, guys, I know this is taking longer than I normally do. I told Coach, I said, we're gonna make it quick, but there's so much of an overhaul to this discipline policy that I wanted to be clear is the file JCDAB, the policy of student alcohol and drug abuse. And so they have revised this policy to put in some safeguards, really a lot more legwork for the school here. So if a student is arrested for possession of distribution or possession or intent to distribute while on school property, the student shall be referred to the principal and or the counselor, and they will have the student tested. All right, so the student's going to be tested for drugs or alcohol. If the test comes back positive, then the student is going to be referred to a diversion program. And based upon that student's willingness to attend the diversion program, when it comes down to the mandatory discipline of that student, the board will then take into account how long that student has been in the diversion program, the treatment program, and the policy says the board will have the final say on the consideration as a positive factor in determining the length of discipline the student receives. So there's a lot of layers that's been added to literally to discipline in the school. Any questions about student drug and alcohol?
Does that mean everyone related to that's going to come in front of the board?
It could. It has the potential to come that far. But normally we handle things with Mr. McCauley's office, and we already have a program called Changing Paces that we have in place. So we feel like that's going to suffice for most every situation that happens.
All right.
When do they?
I mean, after all these steps, because usually we should send them straight there, it's the big three.
Big three, that goes right there.
Okay.
But everything else that we're talking about tonight are outside of those things. And again, it's that the student code of conduct starts with infractions and interventions that work their way up. Everything is based off classroom and school discipline to keep the kids in class, which is going to be a challenge for administrators to re-engage their discipline tactics. But they can do it. We're going to frame it to where it's impossible.
Just more of a process now.
More steps.
More steps.
A lot more steps. The last one is JCDAC, which is dangerous weapons. They have formally defined dangerous weapons. Just want to give you this. Any means of any gas, liquid, and/or substance or instrument which could produce death or great bodily harm. That's an automatic if you have one of those. And then they define firearms in a school. Firearms in a school, because there's been issue with pretend guns where So now we've got a firearm in the school. AJ, is this? It means it's any pistol, revolver, rifle, shotgun, machine gun, submachine gun, black powder weapon, or assault rifle that is designed to fire a fixed cartridge. Is a dangerous weapon or a firearm. And a 2.5-inch knife. I'm sorry, Mr. Mayor. You know, we've got to get clarification on that, because the way I read the policy is that's the intent of it. So the child that brings the toy pistol isn't removed from school. In the past, that's what we've done. But this policy, this act is going to be a challenge to change our mindset to maintain student discipline. It's going to be a challenge. We brought it up last week at the principal's meeting, but we had to get it to you guys first before we now sit down and talk to the principals about really what this entails and how we're going to try to approach it. So there's some things that we still have to work through. We got to come back to you with a new student code of conduct. We got to come back to you with virtual learning discipline plan. We got to come back to you with some other things that have to be worked out that are more related. And so we're going to do that. We're going to jump on it as soon as you guys are affirmed tonight's meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Willis. Not a member of the committee, but would like to ask you, when you rework all of the virtual and all the other things, could we also look at our extracurricular participation guidelines that go along with these updated things? Something that came to mind. Thank you.
Mr. Dean. Anyone else? Comments or questions? Mr. Rowland, you would like approval of the certificate as you submitted them to us.
Make a motion to approve the items that were discussed.
Motion by Mr. Bamberg, second by Ms. Darby, to approve the amendments and changes. Again, I believe everyone received the specific actual revisions, so that we have time to review them, because they are a little burdensome and it's not a quick read. Any other questions or comments? If not, please vote. Unanimous. Thank you, Mr. Rowland. And that concludes our administrative committee meeting for this day.